You could share the agenda. It's brief.
Okay, how are we doing on the population back here? 2 attendees. So the hour is 2:04. I'd like to call the Harbor Planning Committee meeting of July 1st, 2024 to order. I apologize for the late change and the remoteness for reasons unforeseen. It was better off having everybody at home versus trying to get stuff into a room downtown. As the recent amendments to the open meeting law allows, the Harbor Planning Committee will continue to hold meetings remotely. Adequate alternative access to the meetings are provided through the following meeting conducts. There is a small typo, so obviously this is not the planning board, but the Harbor Plan Committee. So we'll do a brief introduction of panelists and staff. I'm the chair, Rick Noonan. We have Greg Cadamatore, who is our planning director, Tom Balfe, Al Catone, Katie Call, Tessa Brown, and Vito Gigaloni. We're missing 2 members, but we're going to get moving at the moment. So next under business under the agenda is discussion of the regulatory section of the draft plan, supporting use allowance, alternative site coverage ratio for 65 Rogers. We can just take them as they come forward. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Sure. So I'll just share a different screen. So at your last meeting, we had a review from UTL et al. About the potential regulatory components of the plan. And they kind of walked through the 5 adjustments to the straight Chapter 91 regulations that will be incorporated in this plan. One being some flexibility in the definition of the water dependent use zone. A couple of examples were shown, and as Vito pointed out, it's not really something that's accessible to smaller lots or lots that are entirely within jurisdiction. It is the same, the same thing that was offered in the last plan, so there's no real change. And again, they also identified what was an extension of what was included in the plan in 2014, and then what was potentially new. So that was a substitution, and then there are another classifications of potential changes called amplifications. We had one pertaining to displacement of commercial vessels. So there's a standard that's applied that if there's any new use of a parcel in the DPA, as well as in the planning area in general, that if there's going to be any potential displacement of commercial vessels, that an adequate alternative site would have to be identified. Promoting public waterfront access and preserving boat access, again, kind of similar along those lines of ensuring that there's no displacement. And then the continuation of the potential use of the Port Maintenance Fund, which was established in the last plan, only used in one instance. I don't see that that's something that would be used very often, but as it was established, it was carried forward. And then we had a fair amount of discussion about what's termed an alternative site coverage ratio. In the last plan, there was an allowance of up to 50% supporting use across the DPA for all properties that were within jurisdiction. And the state fairly early on in this harbor planning process, because of what they've identified and learned in other harbor plan approvals, that without a mechanism in place to ensure that certain properties were not going to utilize the 50% provision, they had no mechanism of approving that. So, and I'm just getting a text message from Tony. So let me, well, I'll finish this, and hopefully he can get in through the link. So one of the things, and if you review the meeting of November 17th, 2022, a similar table of what was going to be pursued was presented to the Harbor Plan Committee at a meeting. And we talked about the potential for trying to work with this different mechanism called an alternative site coverage ratio to provide for 50%, up to 50% supporting use, specifically for 65 Rogers Street. One of the reasons and rationale for pursuing this was because, most of
Hey,
what
Greg,
yes,
I'm sorry if I can interrupt. Tony just called me. He didn't get the link.
okay. I will send it to him right now. I'll pause.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Could you let him know to just come in through the public link through the city website? That would be the fastest, and I can bring him in.
Okay.
If he has access to that. So one of the reasons was, the public interest in this publicly owned property, that many of the scenarios that were presented of different potential future use scenarios all potentially used more than 25% of the site as supporting use. Again, these could be potential community uses. And that, what was arrived at through a lot of discussion with DEP and CZM was, again, it was something that was up to 50%. It doesn't have to be 50%, and would provide for the discussion of if there is a scenario that's identified that's accepting of the community, and it somehow, was in excess of utilizing 25% of the site as supporting use, it will provide that flexibility. And that is kind of where we left the last meeting. And we obviously didn't have a full complement of members at the last meeting. And so after trying several times to find a meeting time to meet with folks, we arrived at today. And I apologize for not being able to do this in person. I'm definitely under the weather and could not be at the meeting, and thought we'd be able to hear each other better, to have a discussion in this kind of setting. So that's kind of where we left things. And if I have the other slides that have the specifics of the individual proposals, but I think it really centered on the concern around the 50% going away, which the state has basically categorically said they cannot approve in a new harbor plan, that provision. And then, kind of a focused discussion about whether or not the alternative site coverage ratio is pursued.
Greg, can I ask a question? You've probably gone over this, but is it CZM who is saying you can't put the 50% use in across the board in the harbor plan, or is it DEP that does the licensing?
I believe it's DEP. I mean, collectively, they're both saying the same thing, but they're saying it's not a provision that's supported. I guess to some degree, they're also indicating that maybe it was the wrong approach, and that this alternative site coverage ratio is something that's identified in the regulations that could potentially be used. But essentially, if there's not a kind of a deed restriction kind of abacus to kind of identify those sites that would never use it, it could upset the apple cart. I think we provided a lot of information as to how we would never exceed the harbor-wide allowance of 25% commercial use. And that, we had confirmation from sites like the State Fish Pier that is 100% commercial fishing by deed restriction, that it did not seem like it would be something that would ever be surpassed. They, I guess, used an analogous analysis of what was suggested in, I think, Lynn, where they were kind of redistributing open space requirements to kind of consolidate open space. And likewise said, if there's no way to kind of track that by deed restriction, that it's not something that they could approve. And I'm going to bring Tony in. I think I just found him.
There he
Sorry
is.
about that, Tony.
Muted.
Hey, Tony.
So Greg, if you want to pick up on the sort of coverage ratio, is just, I don't know.
Vito has his hand up.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if it was raised or not. Thanks, Greg. So I'm just curious, the state fish pier is quite a significant piece of real estate as far as acreage goes. So where that is already deed restricted, that means there should be something south of 50% and north of 25. That wasn't pointed out to us at this stage by the consultants, but that kind of seems like a no-brainer to at least understand that.
Yeah, so I mean that was some of the rationale for the 50% in the last plan. We, again, without any certainty, but a lot of the sites that are categorically water dependent industrial use, anything that's supporting commercial fishing, as well as the state fish pier, was all identified and calculated to kind of amass how much of the site, how much of the DPA was essentially not going to change from a water dependent industrial use. And not only did we, again, we kind of reiterated that, they're saying from a regulatory standpoint, they can't approve it. So we tried to make that argument once again. We had meetings with, with Mass Development. We had a copy of their long-term lease of the site, what they offer to leasees. And again, all of that kind of demonstrates, I think, to a certain extent, that you would not come up against those other standards DPA wide. But they said it was just the technical aspect of it that they could not approve.
And so how does this new ratio sort of mitigate our concern? I mean, as an approach, right? I mean, I guess.
Well, I mean, so back in November of 22, the part of this plan also had a fair amount of focus on potential future use of 65 Rogers Street. 112 Commercial Street is outside of the DPA, so the city has the flexibility to do what it wants there, otherwise following the Chapter 91 regulations. And given the scenarios that had, a wide variety of potential future use, I thought there was agreement to pursue, kind of a special case for 65 Rogers Street, as it's one of the few city-owned assets. And if there was a collective support for, a community use on the site, along with water-dependent industrial use, some sort of split, any potential number of combinations that might fall somewhere between 25 and 50% of the site, that it would be worthwhile to pursue, that flexibility. There are tenants that have to be found by DEP in the licensing of any future use scenario, which include maintenance and support for the commercial marina, as well as, doing all the things that maybe go a little bit above and beyond in terms of, a development that would transcend kind of just the basic FEMA requirements and be a resilient design. So those, if that's, I understand that it is a difference of treatment of private property versus this public property, but at the same time, we're not imposing, public use of those private sites as well that are being used for water dependent industrial or potentially using supporting use. This would be a provision that would provide for some potentially collective community use of the public property. And if that doesn't make sense, then any future use scenario will have to follow every other property's requirement of a maximum of 25%.
Well, it sounds as though we don't have a choice as we move forward. right? I mean,
Well,
except,
you don't have to add a provision that is, the alternative site ratio has to be approved by DEP. It has to be proposed in the harbor plan. If it's excluded,
yeah,
then it's just not something that would be pursued, and any future licensing would have to follow what every other property has to follow.
so at the very minimum, it's a placeholder, right, for an approval process.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we left the last meeting, UTIL is prepared to, put the draft plan into final form for submission, and it's a matter of what's included in that plan.
Mhm.
I think because we did so much front end work with DEP and CZM, the drafted substitutions, amplifications, and this alternative site ratio are something that they see as approvable. But it's a matter of what the committee feels should be included, and that certainly wasn't clear at the end of the last meeting.
Greg, if I could, or Chairman. We lost Rick.
Possibly.
Oh,
Oh,
right here.
there he is.
All right,
There you are.
sorry, I got a phone call from my mom.
Oh,
Yeah, those, the wife and the mom, you got to pick those ones up.
absolutely. You bet.
Sorry.
So quickly, my concern from this, from the get-go as a committee, is how we rationalize the difference here. It's very inconsistent with what the state has basically given us, indirectly for feedback to say that there is no flexibility in the 25%. Yet they're saying it's potentially approvable to have one property. And so I know I'm in a terrible position. We speak to property owners all the time, and this to me is putting out the potential for something to be done on that property that under the auspice of it being potentially a public benefit when we don't know what that project is. And so if it ends up being what a lot of people fear, and I'll say I'm not one of them at this point because they have to go through licensing. Why would something that the public might not be happy with, or other property owners not be happy with, not yet to be disclosed, come forward, and then all of us be tagged with, hey, you approved this 50%, thing, and you're part of the reason why we're fighting something with one hand tied behind our back, so to speak. So, I'm just saying, I don't want us to be in that position, and I kind of see that. That's why I don't know how, when I read the rationalization, Greg, in the plan, because of the unique geotechnical aspects of this, there's nothing unique about that. In fact, the soil testing and borings were done after this draft was assembled. So, I mean, everybody in the DPA is on either flowed or filled tidelands. And somewhere between 14, depending on how close you are to the high water mark, between 14 and 40 feet before you get to solid ground that you can build on. That's everywhere in Gloucester Harbor, right? And then in any harbor. It's a huge property. It has a lot of street frontage. So it's by design physically already at an advantage for utilizing up to 50%. Or utilizing the 25%. So there's nothing unique in the negative side there either. So those are the kinds of things that I don't know how we rationalize it. Why not, if it's a great project and it comes forward and there's room in the 25%, if it's approvable now as a blank check, it should be approvable later during the licensing period. So I'm not opposed. I would love to see something done with that property, but I don't know if this is the right approach. I know I certainly haven't heard anything that convinces me that we should do the alternative approach for the one property. Plus, there's the Seaport bond money issue. I mean, when you look at all of these DPAs that have been actually revitalized or try to revitalize, they have access to federal and state funding that none of the properties in Gloucester do. And the one property that's a city property that has access to Seaport bond money, but yet has yet to come up with a project to seek that funding, is the property we're trying to say is in a especially disadvantaged position. And again, there's nothing in my brain that can make me feel like that we're doing something that's consistent with the way we're treating the rest of the DPA. That's where I'm at right now, but totally open-minded.
Tony?
So, yeah, Vito, I couldn't agree more. And also, I mean, I've always been extremely perturbed, to put it mildly, when government gives itself exemptions. That just really cuts against the grain of what's fair. I mean, Vito had a whole lot more to say about this, but that one was one thing. And Greg, did you go through the testing before I got on here? Do we have any results from the borings?
So GZA is finalizing that report. I'll probably have it within the next couple of weeks and can certainly forward it out. I mean, they advanced the borings back. They were very variable. There may be a lot of material that needs to be removed because it's so inconsistent. But they did have refusal at considerable depth as well.
So no surprises from anyone who was here when urban renewal happened. We've all said that it just was a dump heap for the buildings that came down. Any of the hard construction materials wound up in that lot, which did go to Roger Street. The water did at the time. It's also just, I mean, to put it mildly, this site is extremely challenging. The amount of money that it's going to cost, even for a public-private entity to come in there and make something when they have zero access to the water side, and we can talk about reconfiguring those docks all we want. But in reality, you're never going to come to a realistic section of wharfage out in front of that's going to serve any business that's working there unless you remove some of the boats that are there. It's in a spot. And Vito, you know this, you're just next door, but you get a little less of a surge, but that surge comes through there all summer long. The boats that are there do take a beating. Very expensive to put in wave attenuating docks. We did it at the harbor master's office, and that was just a short run. It wasn't anywhere near the size of what that would be for breakwater docks. This site is extremely challenging. And I think to make this 50% allowance is just, and have that PR, it's looking like that's our crowning, shining moment out of this harbor plan, is just, that just doesn't sit well with me. That's it.
Tom or Katie or Tessa, any comments?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I mean, I would agree with both Vito and Tony on this one. It just doesn't seem equitable or right or wise. And having set out as a plan that was really focused on economic development and diversification of our maritime economy, it seems like the only winner here, if you would call it a winner, would be the city. So it does not feel right to me. Two things, I mean, so one is, am I right, Greg? And I don't know how involved it would be, but you are allowed to amend a municipal harbor plan. So if we were to basically keep the ratios consistent across the board at 25% in this plan, and a good project came along 2 years from now, I'm assuming that we could amend the plan for a lot less money than we've spent for this one, but would be a small, small part of a major development, and that's an option. The other thing that I would point out, and whether it's just to delay the approval of a plan that's been hard to get to this near final stage, is that, and a number of us have participated. CZM is assessing its DPA program. It hopefully will make some changes to the DPA program, including supporting use. I suspect they won't here because of DEP's rigid stance, but I think it makes some sense to wait for CZM to come out with their findings and recommended next steps before we submit a plan for finalization, not yet seeing what a new director has in mind. I met with her, Allison Brezius, last week as it relates to East Boston, found her bright and engaging and a good listener, and I think interested in making some changes to the DPA program. So I would wonder whether we just put this on pause for at least a few months and see what CZM comes up with. And I'm not sure that's an option or not, but anyways, as it relates to the ratios, I agree with Tony and Vito.
Is there a timeline on when we expect the output from the
you never know, but it should be within the next month or so that they come up with next steps, and there will be, and it's essentially a draft next steps, and then there'll be further outreach and recommendations. So I don't think we'll get a clear sense until sometime this fall as to substantive changes, but at least we'll have a sense whether it would be worth delaying further the municipal harbor plan or not within a month or two at the latest.
Well,
I
guess
also agree, I
Go ahead,
guess,
Tessa.
with Vito and Tony, who I guess have a lot more history and knowledge of what's gone on before I was sort of involved in any of this, but just from a sort of baseline view of what I have and what I've seen being on this the last few years, I just don't think it's fair to put anyone that privately owns a property in the DPA at a disadvantage based on something that seems like now we're sort of all on fair ground. And I feel like I don't know, it's working. I don't want to put my name on something that then is going to down the line put a bunch of people at a disadvantage from what I've learned this far being on this committee.
So I guess my perspective is that we did an enormous amount of work in the last plan to get to that 75-25 thing, with, as Greg pointed out, state pier, the railways, the things that are always going to be water dependent use, and aggregate that 25% and then allocate it to, things that have variability. And have DEP or CZM said, it's tough to calculate, technically we can't approve it. I mean, it's legislative words on a piece of paper, right? I mean, and to reel that back in, again, if you're trying to foster, the health of a harbor, and this is what I've said to everybody that would listen, look at the patient. Are your regulations beating up the patient? Are they hurting the patient? Or are they improving things? Do you see development? Do you see movement? Do you see investment? And, and then you still are faced with sea level rise and capital and, DEP plans, that are becoming more restrictive in the flood zone that we haven't seen yet. So again, if you're reeling back the flexibility that we put into the last plan, and then, the whole nother set of regulations that have been yet to be defined or coming down the pike, which we have to comply with, it just doesn't make me feel encouraged about being on this committee for the last 2.5 years and saying, this is the best that we can do. And you're going to tell us what to do anyways. And I don't know, that we have an alternative. I mean, half like Tom's idea, just delay it for 6 months and we'll sit on our thumbs and talk about, wordsmithing and commas and, you know, like we've been treated by the state, right? Until we get some direction from their internal assessment. But I'm not encouraged by it. I don't want to just sort of put a vote to it just to get rid of it and then see what doesn't happen for the next 10 years. But it seems as though, you know, and I think I even asked, you know, Catherine Glynn specifically, I mean, what's the hope here, right? I mean, where are these customers that you think that you're holding this thing? Well, we don't really do that. We just put the regulations in place, you know, so call me in 10 years when, you know, there's less happening in the harbor and you don't have a job anymore because there's nothing else to regulate, right? I mean, so I don't, you know, again, I don't want to just sort of move this forward to just put a, you know, nail in it and stop talking about it. But if there's a way to salvage it, or at least, you know, with a straight face, you know, put a good product in front of the mayor's office and CZM, then, you know, let's try to find that path. But, you know, I don't see it right now. Tony, or Vito, I'm sorry. You're still from before. Still muted.
So the idea of the alternative is, Rick, you'd appreciate this, and Greg, you know, knows, you know, more than all of us on this, is sort of like going to zoning board of appeals and asking for an extensive variance without a plan,
Right.
without a project. You can't get one. You can't change your, you know, you got to come in with a full-blown plan, and that's sort of why this feels very inconsistent with everything else that we deal with. But I think we can be, I think it's pretty clear, the stuff that's in there now talking about I4C2 are all things that we can support, right? It's a project that needs to happen at some point. But we don't need to create this disproportionate thing that we can't defend. I can't rationalize it. And it's very inconsistent with the state's already given us, right? Is there is no flexibility. We don't care that the state fish pier is 15 acres of deeded restriction. We're not even going to let you go above 25% anywhere. If there was an analysis by the consultants, you know, they're not on right now, so I don't want to. If there was an analysis by the consultants that said, how many of these properties under water dependent use zone, even under the most extreme amplification benefits that we thought we were getting, but I don't think we really get any, how many properties can actually utilize the 25% anyway? By statute, they're already precluded from utilizing it. So if there was a real effort, as far as I'm concerned, to go down and try to figure out how much flexibility there would be, we might find out there's 35 or 40% already for the properties that can meet the water dependent use zone dimensional restrictions like I4C2 can, you know. So it would, with an equitable investigation and an analysis, rationalize that going forward to the state preliminarily and have them give a nod, yeah, we think this is approvable or not. That would make me feel better about the fact that we tried to make this work across the board, and not for the one municipally owned property without a project planned.
Well, the other part of that extension of your discussion is that, and you're a property owner, right? And so if you're looking at a parcel and there's no clear path to approval, right, or guidelines, and say, oh, by the way, before you even talk about licensing, you got to, you know, demonstrate, do a full-blown, you know, package for development, and then say, oh, well, here's what we need. We need 47% of that, you know, I4C2 upland as an accessory use, then to get sort of preliminary approval to go through the entire licensing thing. And it's going to be 2 years. You know, that's a no, right? From the very beginning, you're going to, you know, spend a couple $100,000, you know, and there's no clear path to approval. I don't think so, right? So again, you know, unless other people have got ideas, I don't know that there's, you know, a terrific outcome for the work that we've already done here in this plan relative to what has been approved in the past. So, Tony?
I couldn't agree more that there's not a terrific outcome on this. I'm very disappointed that this is it, you know. Let's do I4C2, and because I had high hopes that there would be a whole lot more solutions, because we all know all the stuff that's already in there. And I think that the stuff got pared back was the state did that from the last plan. That was just because it had nothing to do with us. And to really think that one parcel on Gloucester Harbor that doesn't have access to the water is going to be the salvation of our industrial base in Gloucester Harbor is a little bit far-fetched. So I'm very disappointed. I don't think anybody on this committee is at all very happy about this plan. So I just wanted to put that out there that we're in agreement. This is not a desired result, but to carve ourselves out, and you would never accept any plan at the planning board that didn't come forward to you as the regulatory agency without a plan in place. So I think we should move forward on this myself. I mean, pausing it's fine too, but I don't think there's any reason to meet until we get an answer.
And Greg, do we have any sort of regulatory mandate as far as us moving forward on moving a draft?
So we are in charge of the initiation of the final plan.
Yeah.
If to Tom's point or question from 15 minutes ago, you can initiate changes to your harbor plan, but I mean, I just want to be realistic with the steps that are in place at this point, with not only the public hearing process, the approval, and then eventual incorporation into the Chapter 91 regulations. I think at this point, Catherine indicated at the last meeting, or maybe even Matt had indicated, we're probably looking at the better part of a year just to get approval. So if you're going to initiate changes in the future, you're probably looking at an 18-month process. Clearly, it's not, it wouldn't rise to the level of cost or effort, but just the timeframes for anything to be changed in these regulations is pretty protracted. That's not to say you put forward what you want to put forward. The extension of the things that were in the 2014 plan, I have no concern that they will be approved. And if you choose to pull back on the alternative site ratio, which by the way was identified and offered in the discussions with DEP and CZM as a different way of approaching kind of a higher percentage of supporting use. If that's pulled off and in the language associated with that, then that could be advanced as well. If there are any changes to the regulations, it doesn't matter whether we have a plan in place or in process. We would be able to take advantage of any changes that are made. My guess is that if they're at the point of kind of reporting back on what they've learned and what they've suggested for ideas, you're probably looking at months to years before those go into place. So, I mean, if you want to kind of monitor that and hold off, I mean, again, there's no hard and fast. At some point, we will close a contract with UTIL and say we're complete. It's been a long haul, but anything from an economic development standpoint that's identified in the plan, doing site investigations, moving on advancement of investment into public infrastructure, those are all things that we can continue to pursue without the plan in place. The existing, the former plan here's the irony: the former plan and its requirements are in place until this plan is noticed and replaces that with approval. So it is a little bit ironic that if someone were to pursue a licensing with 50%, they could try to do that right now. But that's kind of the timeline of things.
So that's a very compelling statement that you just made, right? So And again, so at least on the planning board thing, if we try to, to table an application, we've got a timeline, right? Whatever the timeline is, 90 days. If you present something to the planning board, we do not take action, you are presumptively approved, for your project, right? So in this case, we have a plan that has a 50% accessory use in the uplands from the previous plan. If we decide to pump the brakes indefinitely till such time that we can see Tom's recommendation to say, let's see what comes down the pike from this new angle, there's new internal analysis, then I don't, and again, to Tony's point and my point, I'm not excited about this, right? So I don't know what the other members feel like, but I'm not throwing up the, the white flag to surrender saying we got to be finished with this, but at the end of the day, if that's the case, that's the decision tree, I would say pump the brakes and, and make them wait a little while. And then ultimately, we still maintain the previously approved plan, which says 50% accessory use in the uplands.
I think there's a certain amount of a continuum, but I don't know, for certain. We are into year 4 of this process. So, I think the anticipation is that at some point we'll submit something. They've provided 2 reviews of draft work to get to this point. I think barring, the inclusion of the alternative site ratio, this could be cleaned up to be submitted soon. But, if there's a desire to see what they're thinking in terms of their own internal process and the outreach that's occurred over the last year, I don't think, waiting towards the end of the summer is something that's out of the question.
I mean, so I'd like to hear feedback from the other members on that issue. I mean, Katie or Tessa.
Yeah, I think there are too many questions right now. And if we want to give ourselves 1 or 2 months to have some discussions amongst ourselves or with the entities that we're talking about, that seems to make sense to feel better about this. No one seems to feel great right now.
Yeah. So I guess, we don't necessarily need to take sorry, Vito, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for pumping the brakes. I'm not concerned about what gets built at I4C2. If it's equitable and we have 50%, I would love to see what the same state that's saying that it's absolutely off the table to go above 25% is going to actually honor our 2014 plan. Greg, I would love to see who's going to be the first one to challenge that one. But I don't see any downside to waiting, as long as it's not costing the city money, as long as there's not an expiration on our existing plan. And if the 50% is already expired on our plan simply because of the legal ruling, the change or internally that they just couldn't honor it anyway, then there's no downside to waiting because that's probably already occurred. If it, and if it hasn't, then somebody might do something quick on I4C2 or wherever and take advantage of it, but at least we won't be the committee that said, yeah, we don't care, we're going to slide back to 25%. Let's do it as quick as possible, take any possibility off the table, but leave one property open. And for that reason, I would vote for, pumping the brakes and let's see what comes out of Tom made a great point. We all participated. I don't know if Tessa, you participated in those CZM interviews and all of those different workshops that they had to sort of see what people's thoughts were about the DPA. A lot of us put, some pretty good interviews in on that. They're assembling that, right? They're going to report out, maybe we'll learn something. And just want to comment quickly, the supporting use over pile supported structures in a DPA is an allowed idea under CZM. But because of the water dependent use zones, The consultants did an analysis at our request, and I was satisfied with that, but they determined that there just isn't enough public benefit to it in Gloucester. So that one loophole that's in there is blocked. So if the 25% is blocked, you see where I'm going with it? I feel like
Yeah.
maybe we needed more creativity in trying to figure out how the rest of the DPA is gonna do, squeeze in some profitable, bankable projects, rather than just trying to figure out how to develop I4C2. And the appearance of it would be that. I know that's not what people tried to do, but if we put this forward like it is now, it's gonna be hard to avoid that, that appearance.
Go ahead, Tom.
So I'm fine with putting on the brakes for the reasons stated. Because I know that Vito and Tessa have unlimited legal budgets. I think it would be great for somebody to submit a Chapter 91 license with up to 50% or greater than 25% use, and sort of get in the queue now to see how DEP responds. And truthfully, it would give at least that property owner standing to challenge the conceivably arbitrary nature of DEP's decision to not allow greater than 50% or greater than 25% use. But I'm only kidding about the unlimited legal budgets, but it would be good to cause that to have that happen, truthfully.
I guess the other thing, just to, to start a different thread on this, is that, we're, 3/4 of the way through a planning process, and then we get called into these meetings from CZM saying, hey, tell us how you're doing, and they hire, a consulting group that's, the responses that we got, Tom and I and Greg got, were, what do you think? Tell us what you think you should be doing, right? I mean, so it's a little bit of a naive process to hire an outside consultant, and that they're process driven. They're not DEP, CZM, DPA experts. They have no knowledge. They're trying to create a body of knowledge within a contracted period. This is my third plan in however long, right? I mean, I can't download all that information to a graduate student to say, put it on a chart, and this is, what we want. And then, so it felt a little disingenuous, frankly, right? And so we're putting the best effort that we can forward. In the meantime, they're scrambling to clean their house to a certain degree for some sort of regulatory change that we don't know about, that Tom also, alluded to. So, and we've been on the sidelines for years in this plan, right? And so, I don't know, right? I just want to sit in the sidelines and see what develops, frankly, is my position. So. But anybody want to challenge a Chapter 91 application? I know Monty's joined us, or he was here earlier, so. Well, Greg, any guidance you can offer us?
I will certainly clarify. Again, I think Catherine spoke to this directly about, which plan is in place until when.
Yeah,
It seems pretty unilaterally that whenever we do advance the plan, we will remove the alternative site ratio.
Yeah.
See what can work with the existing provisions. If it's something that can't advance, then we'd have to pursue other means of pursuing it. And we'll kind of wait and report back on what happens or what kind of outreach response to CZM's process from the last year, and maybe hold a meeting specifically on that, just to see kind of where things are heading. And when I receive the final report on 65 Rogers Street, I can certainly circulate that to the members.
okay. Now, would it be worthwhile just, planning a meeting in September or October, right, to sort of continue this process, at least on paper, for the regulators?
If people have their calendars available and can identify something right now, I'd be happy to put a placeholder.
I mean, more to the point of saying we're just not going to talk about it and we're not going to advance a plan, but to say, listen, we need more time to digest and
Yep.
et cetera. And we're having a meeting in October, whatever, and we'll call you then. So I'm open in October.
Okay. And hopefully we'll have an in-person meeting at that time.
Mhm.
How about October 7th, which is the first Monday in October.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Works.
And tentatively, I'll say 3 o'clock at the Harbor Master's office.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all for hanging in there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
All right.
So we just need a motion to adjourn and a roll call.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Need a second, please?
Second.
Second.
So we have a motion by Vito Gigliotti, second by Tom Balfe. We'll have a roll call vote to adjourn the meeting.
Member Noonan,
Yes.
Member Brown,
Yes.
Member Catone,
Yes.
Member Balfe,
Yes.
Member Gross,
Aye.
Member Gigliotti.
Yes.
Okay. I think I
Member
got everybody. Oh, sorry, you were off screen. Member Call.
Yes.
Okay, enjoy the summer.
Yeah, thank you.
You
Get
too.
better, Greg.
Thanks.
Yeah, feel
See ya.
better.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Enjoy
everyone.
the 4th.
Bye.